Now just remember, because brake fluid and brake dust is really toxic, make sure you go out and get yourself some of those old school dishwashing gloves, you silly English peoples.
Blow my nose at you, so-called Arthur King, you and all your silly English kniggets.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. This is Chris from Moto Photo Adventures. We are so glad to have you guys back for another series. If you haven't already, we've done a ton of tutorials on the CB500X, oil change, water pump change, how to plug a tire, blah, blah, blah. So we'll link to some of those, but if you haven't already and you're doing some maintenance on your bike, check out some of the other videos. Today, we're going to talk about brake pads. I don't know why people have this big fear about brakes and brake pads. Replacing your brake pads is actually pretty simple. It's a little wonky, a little, technical, so I can understand a little bit of fear and trepidation. But hopefully after you watch this video, you'll feel right at home and happy to change out your brake pads, which is something you should very quickly learn and pick up. The owner's manual that came with your bike does have instructions on how to do this, of course, for maintenance, but I personally prefer picking up a maintenance manual. It gives you a little more instructions, a lot more detail, and you'll find how to do the brake pad and disc replacement in section 18.7. So I'm going to show you real quickly all the pieces that you need. It's very simple. I do recommend having a good flashlight to check the wear on your brake pads. You'll need the brake pads, of course, that you're going to use to replace your worn ones with. You will need an 8mm socket wrench to remove the brake pin. And for the rear caliper, you'll need a 12mm, and that loosens the caliper itself to give you the proper angle to insert the brake pads. A nice flathead screwdriver is important because that way you can push the pistons back out once you've replaced the worn pads with a pad that's a little bit thicker. And last but not least, you'll definitely want to pick up a torque wrench just to make sure everything is situated properly. I do recommend a couple other things. A little bit of grease will be helpful for your brake pin when you reinsert that and make sure everything is nice and lubricated. And you may want to have a clean, fresh, unopened bottle of brake fluid handy just in case you need to top off once you are done. We already talked a little bit about it, but you don't need the big floppy ones, but definitely get some sort of gloves because, as I mentioned, this stuff is pretty toxic. Are you a focus puller?
Working puller.
All right.
Are you ready?
You ready to get uncomfortably close?
Yeah. That's
Jason.
I'm all about some uncomfortable. And I'm assuming you're rolling on those two cameras because you're making fun of me.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. All right. Ready?
Ready. Most important thing, of course, is to check your brake pads. And how do you do that? Well, one indicator that I'll mention real quickly is you can look at your brake fluid. If you notice, the brake fluid on my rear brakes is pretty low. So that was one of the things that clued me in that it was probably about time. And if you come back here, I'm going to shine my light in here, and this is why a good flashlight is important because it's very difficult to see. As you can tell, here's the brake pad. You can actually look through in there, and it is really, really worn. Another indicator you can see right here, the piston from my caliper, my brake caliper here, is pretty far out. It's pushed way out there. When you put the new brake pads in there, because there's more volume in here, the piston will actually sit further back in. So that kind of shows you how worn the rear pads are on this bike and a good reason for us to replace them. Coming up to the front wheel, we can expect our brake pads, but you need to be down low. You have to look up underneath the caliper to really see it. And as you look up here, you can see here's my piston again. You'll notice that's only about half the distance out as the rear one was. And then right here is the wear on my pad. You can see I still have a good bit of life left on the front brake pad. I'll still pull those out and inspect them, but it looks like we might be able to reuse those. The rear is definitely going to have to be replaced. So with your 8mm socket wrench, we're just going to loosen the brake pin. shouldn't be too tight. And once you get it out of the threads, make sure you keep a hand pressed up against the brake pads, pushing them against the spring clip to release some of the pressure on the pin and help it come out a little smoother. Perfect. At this point, if the brake pads don't just fall out, just wiggle them loose. And they will pop right out of the bottom. Those look pretty good. I actually still have quite a bit of wear left. I think I'm just going to clean these and put them back in. But yeah, I think we're good to go on the front. All right, to clean them, I'm just going to pick up a can of non-flammable brake parts cleaner. Hose them down really good. Get all that brake dust out of there. And don't forget to clean off your pin as well. The brake pad pin is an important part. While you're cleaning the pin off, you'll want to inspect it really well. Make sure that it's not worn, because when these pads are sitting in there, jiggling around as you're rolling down the road, they can cause little indentations to be worn here and here. And when that happens, then as the piston is pushing the pads in and out against your rotor, well, unfortunately, it won't slide as freely because it's got an indentation. So if you find that you've got an indentation on either side, make sure you replace this pin. They're easy and available at any Honda parts store. Once you're done cleaning your brake pads and the brake pin, it's always a good idea to clean the rotor as well. Get any of that brake dust and gook off of there, especially if you're going to be replacing the pads with brand new pads. You don't want any of the old crud to be transferred to the new pads. Excellent. And then last, before we put everything back together, it's always a good idea to put a little light coating of grease on your brake pin. Good idea to clean the outside of your piston as well. It's usually got a bunch of crud built up, and especially if you're going to be replacing that with a new pad, then that piston, which has been slowly coming out as the pad wears down, we're going to have to push it back in. So you don't want a bunch of crud that's built up over time to end up somehow into your caliper. An old toothbrush can be helpful as well when it comes to cleaning the piston. All right, once everything is nice and clean, we're just going to put these pads back in. Make sure that the tips go in so that they get properly seated in the back. Takes a little bit of fiddling to get those grooves back in and the retaining portions in the back. But once you feel like everything is clicked into place, you can start to wiggle your brake pin into place. Just push it up against the spring, push the pads up into the spring, and start working that pin in. Excellent. Now we're just going to grab our torque wrench. And tighten it to 13 foot-pounds of torque. It doesn't have to be very tight. Excellent.
Excellent!
Next, we're going to go upstairs and pump the brakes to make sure that the pistons are pushed nice and solid up against there before we go riding off. Because otherwise, when you go to ride, you could grab a whole brake of nothing. Just a couple little pumps right there, nice and solid. Now that wasn't so bad, now was it? The rear pads are basically the same process. We have a little bit of a hindrance in the way with the muffler, but essentially the same exact process. So let's get to it. All right, so first step is to loosen the pad pin using the 8mm wrench. Don't want to take it all the way out. And then using the 12mm, we're going to remove the caliper bolt here at the back. That is going to allow us to pivot the whole assembly up and allow us access to the brake pads. Next, I'm just going to loosen the friction on the brake rotor by putting this flat screwdriver in there, pushing the pads away from it a little bit. And then while keeping a little bit of a hand on the brake pads, we're going to push this caliper up a little bit. And that allows the pads to drop down out of place. At which point we can finish removing the brake pin, the pad pin. And finally we'll pull the pad pin out and carefully bring the old pads out, making sure you leave the spring in place. Just like before, let's clean everything off real good. And don't forget the rotors. As I mentioned earlier, the pistons have been severely extended because as the width of the brake pad gets worn down, the piston has to come out further and further in order to give you a good braking stop. So at this point you can use the flathead screwdriver we talked about earlier, but we just want to gently push the piston back in. That should give us enough room for the new brake pads to fit. Now this is probably a really good time to discuss brake pads and which brake pads you want to use for your bike. There are essentially two different types. You've got the organic brake pads and then you've got sintered. You may have heard the word sintered. Well, the difference is that organic brake pads are essentially a bunch of fibers and fillers that are bonded together. And the sintered pads are a metallic type of pad that are put together under heat and pressure. The organic pads are going to wear faster, but they're not going to be as abrasive on your discs. So there's a good and a bad to that. You'll have to replace them more often. They do produce less dust, less brake dust, so that's a nice little benefit as well. And the feel of the brake is a little bit more progressive. It doesn't grab quite as quickly. So when you press your brakes, it's a little bit more progressive, easing into the brake. The downside, of course, to that is that can feel spongy. So a lot of people don't like the feel of an organic pad for that reason. And sintered pads have long been very, very popular for racers, but even street riders, people like us, normal everyday riders, are seeing the benefits of using sintered pads as well. They do last longer, again, being more metallic. They do wear your rotors a little bit faster, so be aware of that. Although for most bikes, I mean, I've had mine for 50,000 miles plus and haven't seen any real damage on my rotors. And of course, the other big advantage is the stopping power. So since you get that extra punch of stopping power, that real nice crispness to the feel of the brake, you can usually stop faster. You get a little bit more responsiveness in your braking. So for that reason, I choose EBC brakes, and the FA140HH is the one that I'm going to use for the rear brake pads. And I use the same, basically the double H sintered brake pad from EBC for the front. And I'll put a link in the notes as well so you know which ones to get. Wow, you can really see a big difference in these brake pads. Just like before, we're going to make sure and clean up our pad pin nice and good. And while you're at it, there's a stopper ring at the very end. You want to make sure and inspect that, make sure that's not been ripped or damaged. Seeing no excessive wear, we're going to grease the shaft again, just like we did in the front, and prepare to reinstall the new pads. When you insert your new pads, just put them all the way back in, push the caliper up to give you the angle you need, and make sure that the pads are resting comfortably against the pad retainer in the very back. Slide your nicely re-greased pad pin in. As before, just pushing the brakes up against the pad spring at the top. No need to tighten it all the way, because before we get to that part, we're going to reinsert the caliper bolt. There is a rubber washer around where the caliper bolt is. So you want to make sure and inspect that as well, make sure there isn't any damage on that. And the caliper bolt takes 16 foot-pounds of torque. Again, not too tight. Just a nice little snug fit. Then you can tighten the pad pin the rest of the way. Like the pin in the front, the pad pin is only 13 foot-pounds of torque. Just like before, you want to pump the rear brake pedal a couple of times to make sure those pads get nice and tight against that rotor. That way you don't have any funny surprises when you go out for your first ride. Now when you check the brake fluid level at the reservoir, you'll notice it's back up to the very top where it should be. And Bob's your uncle. It's that simple. Really not that hard to change your brake pads. I know there's a little fear and trepidation when you're first doing it for your first time, but armed with a little bit of knowledge and a little bit of patience, it's really not that hard. Now we've got brand new brake pads on our bike. I do recommend when you go out for your first ride, go very slow and do a few light tests to break in the pads. Really do some slow maneuvers and some slow braking, just to kind of break in the new pads, get everything aligned, make sure that the grooves on the rotors get lined up with the grooves on the pads, you know, get everything nice and situated before you start blazing down the freeway. But that's it for our video, and we hope you enjoyed it. Please give us a thumbs up, and remember, as I mentioned earlier, we've got lots of other great content, tutorials, reviews, and adventure films. So come on back, check out some of our other episodes. We'd love to have you around, and we look forward to seeing you in the next one.